expert skydiver prepares for another jump, soars through thin air, and makes a perfect landing. A former high-voltage lineman back at work after a horrific industrial accident operates a backhoe on his new job. A high school baseball coach slides into home, and a child tries out a new bike. Ordinary, everyday activities, except that each of these extraordinary people has lost a limb, and most are double amputees. But thanks to the miracles of space-age materials and design, they are all able to lead active, fulfilling lives. Lives that were an impossible dream just a few decades ago. Man's efforts to replace missing body parts with some sort of prosthesis or artificial device go back to the dawn of history.
From the earliest times, why, to survive, you had to be able to get food and you had to fight. And if you couldn't do those two things, then what good were you to the tribe?
The ancient Greeks and Romans designed pottery and mosaics showing the survivors of battles and accidents wearing peg legs. The first written record of an amputation and subsequent prosthesis is the heroic tale of Queen Vishwa, who lost her leg in battle, only to return to the field on some sort of rod. The story first appeared in the Rig Veda, the oldest of India's sacred Hindu writings, somewhere between 3500 and 1800 BC.
Very little is known of what the actual prostheses were like.
Whatever these ancient prostheses were like, they had to begin with some kind of socket that connected the residual limb with the artificial limb. Eventually, the socket probably evolved into a wooden or leather bucket, a basic prosthetic concept that has endured until recently. Even the methods of attaching the socket to the body remain the same for thousands of years. Prosthetic devices continued to appear in art and literature. In the 5th century BC, Aristophanes wrote a part in his play The Birds for a man wearing an artificial leg. And Herodotus recounted the story of a Persian prophet named Hegesistratus in the Histories, written around 430 BC.
The Spartans condemned Hegesistratus to death. But before the sentence could be carried out, he was apparently shackled.
And so, Hegesistratus was his own prosthetist, centuries before there was a word to describe the people who design and fit artificial limbs. And he also had to perform his own amputation, which was at best a brutal and bloody business, since the wounded limb was simply chopped off without benefit of anesthesia. But even in the pre-Christian period, there was some knowledge of limb preservation. As early as the 5th century BC, a work attributed to Hippocrates described the use of ligatures to tie off the blood vessels and stop the bleeding. But not every early civilization cared about saving the life of an amputee. In ancient Egypt, for instance, the idea of entering the afterlife with a missing body part was far more appalling than being disabled in this life.
A dead body had to be buried or put in a sarcophagus, whatever, whole. And if a person died with a missing limb or part of a limb, then a funerary prosthesis would be made.
The oldest known artifact of a usable prosthetic device was a bronze leg that probably belonged to a Roman soldier during the Samnite Wars of the 3rd century BC. Designed for a below-knee amputee, the leg was excavated from a tomb in Padua, Italy in 1858. Fortunately, a plaster of Paris replica was made of the prosthesis before it was destroyed during the bombing of London in World War II. But the iron hand reportedly used by another Roman centurion, Marcus Sergius, around 210 BC, was never even found. Designed to hold a shield, the hand would have been both an early example of the armorer's art and his ability to serve as a prosthetist, but it was an art that would be lost for the next millennium. Many of the sophisticated surgical procedures developed by the early Greeks and Romans were lost during the Dark Ages, which descended on Western Europe around 200 AD and lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It was a period of profound piety and great brutality. Given the battles, diseases, and violence of feudal society, there was probably no shortage of amputations. But only a few hardy souls could have survived the primitive surgical techniques, which often involved crushing the injured limb before cutting it. If the patient survived the amputation itself, he still had to face the agonizing process of trying to seal the wound, either by pouring boiling oil onto the limb or by applying some other form of searing heat.
They also would have sometimes a bucket of hot tar. They'd dip the stump in hot tar, or they'd heat up usually a sword, broad sword, and they would, after it was red hot, they'd put that against the stump to cauterize the stump.
No record exists of any attempt to provide the poor with prosthetics. If amputees couldn't create some sort of crude artificial limb for themselves, they were destined to spend the rest of their lives scooting through filth and muck on wheeled boards. By the 13th century, the Dark Ages began giving way to the Middle Ages. Wars raged throughout Europe and Asia, and wealthy knights, the professional soldiers of their time, kept their armorers fully employed.
Who best to make it? The person who made armor.
They were probably the gurus of that time when it comes to articulation, because they really were able to do a lot of articulations with the suit of armor.
The prosthetics designed by these skilled artisans weren't always functional, but they were still essential to the knights who wore them, because they disguised their infirmities and allowed them to return to the field of battle. The design of some of these medieval prosthetics was truly amazing, both from an aesthetic and mechanical perspective.
There are a lot of perforations or holes cut in this, and I'm sure that's to keep it light so that the wearer isn't fatigued by the weight of so much metal on the end of their residual limb.
Among the more remarkable prosthetics produced between the 15th and 17th centuries is the Alt-Rupen hand, believed to have been forged around 1400. The thumb is rigid, but the fingers move in pairs and are sprung by the buttons at the base of the palm. But the most famous of all historical prosthetics is the iron hand of Götz von Berlichingen, a 16th century German knight who remained a German folk hero well into the 20th century. His iron hand was forged in 1509 and is still in working order. The four jointed fingers are operated either by pushing them against something or adjusting them with the natural left hand. By pressing on a button, all the fingers will stretch outward. The thumb operates in a similar manner and can be outstretched by pushing on another button. When all the fingers are locked into position, the hand can hold a shield or wield a sword. All in all, Götz, who actually owns several of these hands, found his prosthesis quite satisfactory, with one exception. He is reputed to have said, in fact, the famous hand of Götz von Berlichingen, with its remarkable function, was the exception to the rule of iron prosthetics, which were probably removed with the rest of the knight's armor when he returned home. The greatest contribution to the advance of prosthetics in the 16th century was made not by an armorer, but by Ambroise Paré, a French surgeon known as the father of prosthetics. In 1552, while serving in the army of King Francis I, Paré reintroduced the use of ligatures in amputation, thereby sparing his patients the agony of cautery. By reviving a protocol that had first been proposed by Hippocrates 1,000 years earlier, Paré introduced a renaissance in surgery. But his contributions to prosthetics were not limited to his surgical techniques.
The artificial limbs he made, They were quite shapely. They were made sometimes rather like armour, with overlapping plates where the joint was across the knee and the front of the ankle, and they were sturdy. He also designed an elbow. It had a spring, I think about 3 feet long, actually in the side of the elbow, and a great big ratchet. And the arm could be brought up in stages.
The tourniquet, introduced by Etienne Morel in the late 17th century, greatly increased the odds of a patient actually surviving amputation surgery long enough to need an artificial limb. And in the 19th century, Napoleon's personal surgeon, Dominique Jean Larrey, packed ice and snow around the residual limbs of amputees to slow the bleeding and dull the pain. Despite these advances, the mortality rate for amputees remained appallingly high. Monsieur Larrey, for instance, is perhaps best known for the number of amputations he performed at one time, 224 hours. And he was particularly pleased that 4 of his patients actually survived.
The surgeon's skill was measured in how fast they could amputate a stump, and that included cutting the meat with a knife and using a saw to go through the bone. There's the surgeon who could do it in 20 or 30 seconds. And in one instance, why the surgeon that not only cut off the person's leg in 30 seconds, also cut off 2 fingers of one of the guys holding them down and one of the testicles of the patient.
While war has always accounted for a high percentage of all amputations, limbs were also lost to disease, congenital birth defects, and accidents. And in the days of the tall ships, the voyages of discovery, and the great maritime battles, accidents were inevitable.
A lot of the sea captains lost their arms when they were holding onto a rope and the rope just pulled their hand off. And before you know it, they went around the ship, found a little hook and a little piece of leather, wrapped it around, and here they were, the captain hook on the ship and back sailing and traveling the world once again.
Despite the advances made in both surgical techniques and prosthetic devices over the centuries, these basic hooks and peg legs were destined to remain a popular option for many amputees until well into modern times.
There's a catch on the back to allow knee to be flexed, and it should lock in that position so that one can sit down.
By the late 19th century, amputees could do a great deal more than just sit, stand, and walk. Like the metal hooks and wooden pegs used by early sailors, many of the devices created during the Renaissance anticipated the designs of modern prosthetists.
A Dutch surgeon called Verdun actually devised an artificial limb for a below-knee amputee that had jointed side steels. They come up the side of the leg, and then he had what he called a cuff, which is similar to what we have today and call a thigh corset.
Not all advances in prosthetics came from doctors or surgeons. Throughout history, people in need of an artificial limb frequently turned to local craftspeople for assistance.
Your blacksmith was your first prosthetist. And of course your carpenter was also a prosthetist, because a carpenter could carve a peg leg, a carpenter could carve a wooden socket for a stump, for a leg to fit into.
They would go to the person who was making saddles for horses and harnesses for horses. And the harness maker would turn around and build a prosthesis for this person. And I've seen prosthetic devices made out of ceramics, where the potter would actually make the socket. So there's been a lot of interventions from all forms of artistic people in how to get a person back up and walking again.
By the early 1800s, a number of innovations had been made in artificial limbs, including the Raviton leg, which consisted of a laced leather boot filled with horsehair and an ankle joint controlled by a spiral spring. A German dentist named Bailiff designed a hand with fingers that could be controlled by the movement of the remaining elbow joint. The first time that muscles in the residual limb were used to animate a mechanical device.
He actually reversed what had been the standard procedure of passive opening and active closing. He had active opening of the hand and passive closing, which is what we actually have today.
In 1800, an above-knee prosthesis consisting of two wooden cones with an articulated steel knee joint was patented by James Potts in England.
This particular leg was different from all others because when the knee flexed, the foot also came up. It was linked by cords which ran through the shin.
This enduring, ingenious prosthesis was known as the Anglesey leg after the Marquis of Anglesey, who used it after losing his own leg at the Battle of Waterloo.
Until very, very recently, legs were being made on the Anglesey principle and still known as Anglesey legs.
In 1839, a former employee of James Potts, William Selfo, modified the Anglesey leg and brought it to the United States. 7 years after that, when an amputee named Benjamin Palmer altered the limb to suit his own needs and patented his improvements, the Anglesey leg became known as the American leg.
It was exciting times for a person who had lost a limb, where now, when they would lose a limb, let's say above the knee, when they sit down, both knees would bend. When they stand up, they could walk with a knee flexing and extending just like the other side.
The American leg was further modified in 1858 by a Dr. Douglas Bly, who introduced a movable ankle joint consisting of an ivory ball fitted into a socket of vulcanized rubber. Bly modestly referred to his leg as the most complete and successful invention ever attained in artificial limbs. Bly's leg and other improvements in the design of artificial limbs were influenced as ever by advances in surgical techniques, many of which were made possible by the French discovery in 1842 of the anesthetic properties of chloroform.
With anesthesia, it began to be possible to produce a more satisfactory surgical result.
James Syme, Chief of Surgery at the University of Glasgow, was actually the first surgeon to address the difficulties of creating a residual limb that could be easily fitted with a prosthesis.
What he did was to look at the problem of the ankle disarticulation. This is where the foot is removed at the ankle joint, and he preserved the heel pad and sewed that into the residual limb and created a soft pad at the end that would allow the tissues to be protected by a block of shock-absorbing material that is really quite close to what nature originally intended.
In 1867, Syme's student and son-in-law Joseph Lister made a major contribution to medicine and prosthetics with the publication of Principles of Antiseptic Surgery. Unfortunately, this landmark work came too late to help the victims of America's bloody Civil War, where 30,000 amputations were performed just by the Union Army surgeons.
They wore the bloody aprons, they didn't wear gloves, they didn't wash their hands, so they cut off this limb, they go to the next person, cut off that limb, the next person, the next person. So they had, germs were rampant throughout the battlefield.
Despite the septic conditions, thousands of amputees survived the Civil War, creating an unprecedented demand for artificial limbs. In 1861, James E. Hanger, a Confederate soldier who lost his leg in the first battle of the war, recognized this need and founded America's first and now its largest prosthetics manufacturing company.
He decided that he could make a lighter weight prosthesis and came up with some of the first metal limbs back over 100 years ago. And those metal limbs today continue to be fit in England, which is incredible, you know, that a 100-year-old leg is still fit today.
He had his own kind of foot, special articulating foot, and his own type of knee, a hanger foot, a hanger strap with his signature on it.
The Civil War marked the beginning of a remarkable period in American prosthetics history. Over the next 50 years, nearly 250 patents were filed for such diverse inventions as rubber feet, suction sockets, ankle joints, and articulated limbs.
Continually today, people apply for patents and to find that, wow, you know, somebody came up with this 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
This revolution in prosthetics design continued into the early 20th century, with such remarkable advances as Marcel de Suter's all-aluminum leg and the split hook developed by D.W. Dorrance, a version of which is still being used today.
And there's not been many advantages or advances since then, except this hook is now made out of aluminum. My first hook was steel.
Individuals continued to design prosthetics, but the actual business of manufacturing artificial limbs was dominated by companies like J.E. Hanger and A.A. Marks of New York. Amputees could also get their limbs direct from the pages of such mail-order catalogs as Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward's. But the greatest advances in the art and science of prosthetics were inspired once again by war, the First World War. With the onset of World War I, the focus on prosthetic design and manufacturing shifted back to Europe. The American Expeditionary Forces suffered 4,403 amputations in the war. Injuries resulting in amputation in all the armies of Europe, however, totaled a staggering 300,000, most of them the result of brutal fighting in the trenches.
There were no antibiotics then, and it was found that infection occurred very, very quickly. And if a wound was stitched up with the infection inside, it was 10 times worse. And the patient would die of what is known as gas gangrene. To prevent this happening, immediate amputation was performed. And that's why there were so many thousands of amputations performed during the First World War, far more than in the Second War.
In 1915, the British responded to this crisis by establishing a pioneering research and rehabilitation center at Roehampton, a country mansion outside London. Queen Mary's Hospital was also founded there, and an entire prosthetics industry grew up around Roehampton. Thanks in part to the work done there, most wartime amputees were restored to some measure of function. For the first time, surgeons routinely consulted with prosthetists to determine the most effective way to shape the residual limb in order to achieve a comfortable fit with the artificial device.
The level of amputation has a lot to do with your success in rehabilitation. The higher the amputation, the more difficult it is to fit with a prosthetic device, and the less functional it is.
Fitting the patient almost immediately after surgery also improved his chances of recovering function.
This is a temporary prosthesis for a below-knee amputation. It's known as a Philpott limb, and it was fiber with a comfortably, or hopefully comfortably padded socket. This was only a temporary limb while a proper limb was being made, and also while the stump was settling down after the amputation.
Once again, many of the prosthetic designs that emerged from the war came from the amputees themselves.
This was designed by a Major Lightfoot. Now, these were given, like the Philpott leg, as a temporary limb while a proper limb was going to be made for them.
Despite the number of veterans needing prostheses and the development of such potentially useful new materials as nylon and bakelite, there was still no centralized effort to improve artificial limbs, either in Europe or the US. And so in the years between the world wars, many patients preferred to stick with familiar time-tested materials, and wooden sockets were still painstakingly pulled and shaped by hand, just as they'd been 100 years earlier.
You take this tool and you can relieve this. So it's so. Then if you get it so dug out so as far as you think you might need, then you have to hand sand it. You have to go back to the patient again and try them again.
This leg comes from about the 1920s, and it's practically all wood. And in order to give the wood back then, they put leather all around the wood. And what happens is they steep the leather in water and bring it up and wrap it around the socket here and around the shin section and let it dry overnight, and it just tightens in around the wood and keeps it very solid and strong.
The demand for prosthetic legs is usually far less than it is for upper limbs. But the 1920s and 30s still saw some remarkable individual efforts to take on the greatest prosthetic challenge of all, to create hands that combined a pleasing natural appearance with a significant degree of function.
When a hand is missing, it is of vital importance that function is maintained, and as far as the patient is concerned, cosmesis is retained. But it is very difficult to have the two.
The advantage of this hand is that when the person picks something up, all fingers move. And how they operate is through a cable. And the cable goes right up through a little control unit here where they can actually lock the fingers closed, and the person will do that with their sound hand. It's a fascinating piece of equipment, just beautifully engineered.
It was war once again that brought about the next major changes in prosthetics. In 1945, as the number of amputees in World War II mounted, Surgeon General of the Army Norman Kirk requested that the National Academy of Science convene a committee of surgeons, engineers, and prosthetists to investigate the best ways in which the most effective limbs could be provided to disabled veterans.
The National Academy of Science, all those high-level people figured out what veterans already knew, and that was the quality of limbs was poor and there was no way of delivering them.
Out of that came this startling fact that there had been no scientific approach to the amputations and prostheses. And so they said, well, we've got to do something about this. The idea was that the surgeons would give the engineers the criteria needed to design prostheses to satisfy the needs of the amputees. But it turned out that the surgeons didn't have the fundamental data to give on locomotion and the functions of the upper limb in order to get design criteria.
The NAS established laboratories at the University of California, Berkeley, to do lower extremity, gait, and locomotion studies, which resulted in the solid ankle cushion heel or sack foot. UCLA, meanwhile, concentrated on researching upper limb biomechanics.
We couldn't quite wait for all those studies to be finished before it was necessary to start gadgeteering. When we kind of got the information and were able to apply it, then the gadgeteering became scientific.
Industry, particularly the aviation industry, also contributed to the development of lighter, more functional prosthetics in the post-war years.
Plastics were an integral part of the development of many airplanes. And the lamination process. Lamination was something that aircraft engineers knew was lightweight, it was layered, and it was structurally stronger than just a solid piece of metal or wood. And what you always strive for with any device is to make it lighter and to make it easy to work, because the body, it takes a lot of energy to use an artificial limb.
In the 1960s, the use of the drug thalidomide by pregnant women resulted in thousands of horrific birth defects and prompted intensive prosthetics research.
These were the prostheses worn by one of my young patients, and one foot would not go down. It was in this position, and that is the position in which this plate is set.
But the most dramatic advances in artificial limbs were yet to come. The extensive research into biomechanics and engineering conducted by scientists, engineers, and prosthetists after World War II resulted in one definite conclusion. The socket, the oldest and most basic component in any artificial limb, was also the most important.
The socket's always been the most important part of any prosthesis because that's where the rubber meets the road.
You've got to have a good fitting socket or it's just miserable. It's like if you get a little pebble in your shoe, it just makes you miserable.
The commission formed by Surgeon General of the Army Norman Kirk suggested a re-examination of the suction socket, first introduced by Dubois de Parmelee in 1868. So scientists began experimenting with various socket shapes made out of hard plastics.
These high-tech plastics were very rigid and solid. So when you put the residual limb into one of these solid sockets, due to the lack of movement and the lack of forgiveness in the socket, the muscle would atrophy inside that socket and it would have this suction on. And because the suction is there, the patient wouldn't have the perceived need to fire up the muscle to hold the socket in place.
This socket shape is the quadrilateral socket shape, which has quadrilateral means four, 1, 2, 3, 4 sides. And they thought it would turn less on the body if they made it square. But it didn't turn out to be that way really because you only have one femur bone going down inside here, and like a knife in a jelly jar, you can still turn that jelly jar around the knife.
John Sabelich solved many of these problems in the 1980s with his patented Sabelich socket, the result of years of cadaver studies. A soft, flexible, fitted socket, it's supported by a carbon fiber frame.
Utilize the hard plastic on the outside, but utilize the flexible plastic on the inside.
Unlike hard sockets, the flexible socket surrounds and supports every bone and muscle in the residual limb, thereby providing the wearer with an unprecedented level of comfort and range of motion.
You can have all the fancy componentry, all the hydraulics and pneumatics and electronics and sense of feel and all that stuff. The prosthesis will wind up in the closet if the socket doesn't fit.
How does it feel? Feels great.
The dramatically improved function of modern prosthetics is matched only by the equally stunning improvements in cosmesis, or appearance of the artificial limbs.
This is a silicone restoration foot. It's completely bendable and pliable and very realistic looking. Looking at the ridges in the foot and the heel and the bottom of the foot. You see veins and hair, even muscle tone in the prostheses.
Unfortunately, it's not yet possible to combine the latest cosmetic advances with the highest level of function in the same limb.
Silicone restoration, very aesthetically pleasing, but a lot less durable. Very susceptible to rips, tears, newspaper ink, ballpoint pen.
Amputees can now customize their prostheses, choosing from among a vast range of both functional and cosmetic components. Sophisticated myoelectric elbows, wrists, and hands, which use electrical impulses from the residual limb to stimulate movement in the artificial device, are now readily available to upper extremity amputees.
When the muscle triggers a signal, we can pick that up on the surface of the skin with a small electrode that's non-invasive, so that when the muscle fires, we read it from an electrode. The electrode tells the computer, hey, this muscle's firing, and then it operates a switch to either open the hand or close the hand or rotate the wrist or raise or lower the elbow.
Lower extremity amputees have even more options. including hydraulic knees and energy-storing feet that allow even bilateral amputees to participate in the fiercest competitions.
Here's a prosthesis with a cutaway design showing the flex foot with the toe lever and the heel lever. So as the patient walks, the heel lever compresses, rolling them forward to foot flat. As they come across the toe lever compresses and shooting them forward. The same technology is carried through to running prostheses, which have only a toe lever. So as they sprint or run on the prostheses, the impact is taken here, the energy is absorbed into the curvature of the carbon fiber spring, stored energy like a leaf spring on a pickup truck, and then propels them forward at an expounded rate. Can't believe it.
In recent years, researchers have also been developing sensory devices for artificial limbs.
It's starting to get warm.
We've done a good job of the motion, the mechanics. We've done a very poor job of the whole other half of the central nervous system.
Hot and cold systems let an amputee differentiate between hot and cold. A temperature sensor in the artificial hand attached to a microprocessor in the artificial arm either warms or cools two thermal piles touching the residual limb. The sense of feel allows amputees to feel where they're placing their feet or how hard they're squeezing their hands.
The harder you press, the more feeling you get back in terms of either vibration or electrostimulation, which is a tingly feeling. Our ultimate goal is to provide all the sensations that you or I have to the amputee.
But not every amputee is eager to try these complicated and expensive devices. For many people like Fred Downs, who still uses a variation of the Dorrance hook developed in 1912, new is not necessarily better.
Terminator, Star Wars, robotics, that's what people's expectations are of how well these things work. And of course, Hollywood has built everybody up to expect these things to work as well as they do, not recognizing in reality batteries go dead, electrical things come unplugged, servo mechanisms break down and are heavy.
Still, with today's rapidly evolving technology, the future of prosthetics is limited only by cost and the imagination of its practitioners. The researchers, engineers, surgeons, and scientists who are striving to create artificial limbs that will look and function almost as well as the real thing. But the ultimate success of all these futuristic devices is still dependent upon the skill and the art of the prosthetist.
It takes a real artist to fit one of these devices to the human body. Now you have a lot of mechanics, they do it by the numbers, but it takes an artist to look at the device and then meld it into the human body, onto the human body, so that it then becomes functional and it's comfortable and it